right. Well, I'm excited to introduce Christian at our P4P Advocacy Alliance meeting today. Christian Adeleke, LMSW, is a social work scholar, practitioner, and PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Arlington School of Social Work. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Florida State University and a Master of Social Work from Florida International University. Christian has had over 5 years of experience in several human service sectors, including substance misuse and mental health, child welfare, children and youth, medical social work, housing, crisis work, and individual and group psychotherapy. Christian's research interests include the ways in which professional social work in its current form upholds the oppressive systems it claims to challenge. And in his view, social work education's signature pedagogy of unpaid internships is one of the most consequential structural changes needed within the social work profession to not only create a more just and equitable profession, but also to ensure this 19th century profession's sustainability in a diverse and evolving world. So, thank you so much for being here with us, Christian.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I would be remiss to not first acknowledge that what I'm going to be presenting today builds off of the work of Minnie Data, Susan Klumpner, and Lisa Ebenoja, in tandem with the Illinois Field Director Consortium and their subcommittee on paid internships. My presentation is going to be different and distinct in that it actually predicted some of the agency characteristics that could explain why or why not an agency would compensate their interns. So I wanted to start with that. And of course, this work is already building off of the efforts that were initiated by the Payment for Placements social movement. So the presentation that this is kind of a sequel or part two to it described who pays, how, some of the barriers that were described, which we'll get into in depth in the presentation. As I stated, it predicted the the potential for agencies to provide compensation as well as integrated insights from a mixed methods design. So it was a cross-sectional survey that was administered in 2023, and over 600, almost 600 agencies responded to it, and they were asked several questions ranging from their budget, how many employees were in the agency, and so and so forth. Yeah, and in taken together, you are able to see how or why, because the quantitative data kind of showed some of the structural, and the qualitative showed some of the thought behind some of those decisions. So only about a third of Illinois field agencies offered a stipend to their interns, which is actually not too bad because in the literature, it can be as low as 10% of social work interns being paid. But of course, our goal is for all interns to be paid. So we would want to see this change in the future. A significant finding, in my view, is that like 42% of the sample, they didn't know whether or not, like, what their budget was for the agency. So I think that in itself is very telling because perhaps people don't feel that that's a part of their job, or if that's even within the realm of possibility, offering compensation to interns. So I found that significant. The quantitative strand of the study looked at the predictors of pay. So I was able to find out that budget played a small but significant role in the provision of stipends to social work interns. So my quantitative analysis revealed that agencies with budgets of at least $2 million were twice as likely to provide compensation to their social work interns. However, as you see here, it only explained less than 4% of stipend provision within this sample. So that just means that I cannot, or we cannot, generalize beyond this sample, but it gives us a snapshot into how this plays out. As some of you may know, the payment for placements movement. In the absence of a national response, this will continue to play out at the state level. So, looking at the state level implications is really important here. And notably, even some high budget agencies, which for this study was conceptualized as more than $5 million for their annual budget, were still unpaid. So you would think that capacity would equal willingness or actually following through with providing that compensation, but that was not always the case. Now, the qualitative strand is so qualitative research is essentially interviews, focus groups, but it can also be embedded in a survey. And that's how it was in this study. So, towards the end of the survey, folks were asked, well, field directors and agency representatives were asked what some of the barriers and facilitators to providing compensation were. And these are the themes that emerged. And so a theme is just a term for like a recurring pattern in the data. So if people are all mentioning the same thing, or even if the language is a little bit different, if they're getting at that same construct, that would be considered a code, and a code goes into a category, which I'm going to get into in the next slide, and then a category goes up to a theme. So we have necessary and beneficial, scarcity and competition, unknown, anti-paid norms and views, and institutional factors. That fifth theme is one that I actually identified in my secondary analysis of the data set. Okay, so I mentioned categories. So these are kind of the intermediary codes. So I think that the themes they really boil down to two main pots. The first one being attitudes and beliefs. So necessary and beneficial, that means that the agency they saw paying interns as necessary and beneficial in that it supports recruitment and retention of interns. They may actually be able to hire that person post graduation. So just kind of being mindful of what everyone gets out of this arrangement when an intern comes to work for an agency. We also had anti-paid norms. So there is a lot of that still present in the profession. So I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the saying social workers aren't in it for the income, we're in it for the outcome. And just a lot of problematic platitudes like those, they can be very detrimental, especially when we're talking about the payment for placements movement and what that represents in terms of student well-being, basic needs security, and financial well-being. So kind of pushing back against that rite of passage paradigm, that I think that would be beneficial. We also had external forces such as capacity and knowledge gaps. So limited funds and supervisors, a lot of places they may be able to supervise the intern, but they don't see the payment as being a part of that. So we're going to get into that later with some more of the quotes when we take a deep dive. Some of them were just unaware, or they had no information or guidance on pay from either the school that placed the student there or just from their preconceived knowledge. And then we also had those institutional factors. So certain agencies had like structural constraints in that interns could not provide services, or the services that the intern provided couldn't be reimbursed. So kind of seeing both sides of the coin would be beneficial. This is a deeper dive. So I chose two exemplar quotes for each theme that emerged. So for scarcity and competition, it said, "Our grants don't cover student stipends, so we compete with agencies that can offer pay. With limited funds, we have to prioritize staff salaries over student stipends." So you see that trade-off there. Unknown. So the topic has never been brought up or discussed in the past. Unsure. Just timing and figuring it all out. Comparable metrics for intern compensation. So wanting to know how much people do compensate interns. Like, what is that amount? What does that look like? And then some of those institutional factors that I spoke of earlier. One respondent said policy dictates that employees in our roles have a master's degree and a license. Policies and procedures are against this. If this became a requirement, we would need to ensure interns would contribute enough to offset the cost. Some of the attitudes and beliefs, internal. So those that saw paying interns for their internships and saw them as necessary and beneficial, they said, we believe it is essential as an anti-oppressive practice. So that is another argument brought up when payment for placements is mentioned in the discourse. It's misalignment with social work's values of social and economic justice. I'm all for interns getting paid. So there are also people that are in support of the movement. They just might not know where to start. And of course, we have anti-paid norms. Some people are more explicit with their concerns or critiques of paying interns. So one individual said, internships are more of a volunteer opportunity. I don't feel they should be paid. And then another quote said, students are learning to work, but aren't quite professionals yet. And I'm not sure if some of you who are aware, that echoes the sentiment of CSWE's 2022 statement. They said that a student still has not met the qualifications of a professional yet. So it's viewed as learning and not labor. And so, but more recently, they did put out another statement with payment for placements, expressing their commitment to accessibility and equitability in social work education for similar reasons that we talk about tonight. So I integrated the findings from the quantitative and the qualitative in what is called a joint display. So it's pretty self-explanatory. You're able to really see the meta inferences. So that's kind of like the what you're able to glean from the totality of it all. So you can really see how budget was significant, but it wasn't the whole story. So, like I mentioned earlier, some agencies that did have the capacity still had some either cultural or other types of like barriers that were internal. So, agencies that were actually low budget seemed to be more willing to provide compensation even if they were unable. And then it was pretty 50-50 with agencies in that mid range of 2 to $5 million. So we have these four main points. Financial capacity could align with equity commitment. Beliefs can block stipends despite resources. Funding limits and lack of guidance restrict action. So just not knowing where to start. And budget alone doesn't ensure stipends. And this study focused on stipends, but we are wanting a living wage. So something hourly or salary, what have you, but something is better than nothing at this point. So now what this means for policy and practice implications, agencies with budgets of $2 million may be better targets of advocacy. And this is again just within the sample that this data set is based on. Culture also played a huge role in this study. Like I mentioned, the rite of passage narratives and paying your dues, for example, and framing it within professionalism, which we know has, a lot of racially charged connotations attached to it. So being mindful of that, as well as educating and persuading agencies to engage in innovative funding ideas. I've heard of work study funds being used, university endowments, donations, an agency paying for the credits themselves. So just very creative ways of, reducing the burden on the student. And even though the effects were small with the quantitative piece, that could give us a better idea or a picture of where to invest and how to target our advocacy efforts. Thank you so much. I feel like I went a little bit fast, so if anyone has any questions, I believe the next portion is going to be dedicated to that. So, thank you so much.